Shalom. My name is Mottel Baleston, and we're including this episode on as part of season 4 of Our Messiah is Jewish, because I'd like to share my testimony of coming to faith as a Jewish man, coming to faith in the Messiah of our Jewish people, Jesus, Yeshua the Messiah. This is something I've shared occasionally, did it in a brief form for the first season, but I think it would be good for folks who have purchased this DVD set or are watching this 4th season to understand Messianic prophecy, to recognize that for Jewish people coming to faith in Jesus as Messiah, the road is never quick, it's never short, because of all of the history and the strife that has gone on between Judaism and Christianity. I came to faith in Messiah in my early 20s. I have now been involved in full-time Jewish ministry for over 30 years. Early on, I went to a 2-year technical college, and I was involved in the dentistry field. I was making crowns and bridges for dentists, working as a laboratory technician, and doing very well in that field in a very prestigious laboratory in New York City. I was on a very successful path. And it was at that time that I came to faith, and I'll discuss that in just a moment. But no, I did not start out in this. I was not born into a believing family. So let me tell you my story, because my purpose in doing this is very simple. I believe that there are many people out there who will watch these videos who have Jewish friends, co-workers, neighbors, even relatives, who need to recognize that God is drawing Jewish people to himself, and that eventually God can use you in this effort, because the hands of God, you want to see the hands of God? Look at my hands, look at your own hands, because most of the time God uses rather ordinary means to accomplish his extraordinary purposes. And he accomplishes that through people just like yourself. So let me tell you my story. All 4 of my grandparents, 100%, all 4 of them were born into Orthodox traditional Jewish villages in Eastern Europe at the turn of the century. They were all born in the 1890s, all in villages in the Ukraine, Poland, and Belarus. They were known as Ashkenazic Jews. They were Jewish people whose original ancestors had left Israel, they had left the Middle East, sometime around the year 700 to 800 AD. Historians tell us this, now the science, the genealogy, and DNA have confirmed it. There was a group of some 30 or 40,000 Jewish people who left the Middle East, and they were invited to come to central Germany, particularly in an area known as the Ashkenaz Valley, and they were invited there by the Germanic city princes. Some of the Germany was not a single nation at that point. There were Germanic princes, and there was a whole bunch of city-states that were scattered in a patchwork around all of what is now Germany and Poland. And Jewish people were invited in because of their expertise at what is called import and export, their expertise in doing business across continents. And the reason that they were particularly adept at this was that they had introduced a system of letters of credit that often were written in Aramaic, occasionally in Hebrew, and those letters of credit could be carried by a sea captain taking a ship and going from Italy and going through the Straits of Gibraltar out to England, picking up goods. And he could use these letters of credit instead of carrying chests full of gold and to barter and to use. And this system of letters of credit facilitated the entry of Jewish people where they were asked to come, set up residence, and help build the economies of various countries. And they were also skilled craftsmen. They had skill in various metalworking trades. They had skills in some of the machinery trades, in all sorts of mechanical trades that required precision and machinery. They did a lot of that work, thus they were invited into Germany. For a while, all went well. They multiplied, they grew, and eventually spread out into other parts of Europe. Within a generation or two, they had, long as kids do, they forget their parents' tongue, and they pick up the language that is they hear all around them. So within just a couple of generations, the Jewish young people were starting to speak German because they heard German all around them. And in order to buy things at the market, you needed to know German. So they picked up German and they constructed a new language known as Yiddish. Yiddish was the native tongue of all four of my grandparents. It was also the native language of my mother, Lorraine. Yiddish is a language that is about 80% old medieval German, 10% Hebrew, and 10% Slavic languages of various type. It is written in Hebrew characters. Again, it's 80% medieval German, and it's written in Hebrew characters. There was a time during which 12 to 14 million people in the world used Yiddish as their major language, perhaps as many as 18 million. And all four of my grandparents were in that group. So my grandparents had been in Europe. They were born in Europe, but there were pogroms that had swept through Europe. The word pogrom is a Russian word meaning a violent shaking up. And pogroms swept through Eastern Europe at the behest of various political and religious groups who were trying to move Jewish people out of lands, trying to persecute Jewish people, did not want Jewish people there. So while initially some of the Germanic princes wanted the Jewish people to help them build the economy, and Jewish people were very successful in doing that, they also were often the first to be blamed when the economy was mismanaged by the prince. So let's say the prince used the Jewish people to build the economy, but then the prince went on a spending spree and he invested lots of money foolishly. He went against the advice of his counselors and lost money, and the nation was plunged into famine. Well, he didn't want to say that it's my fault. Instead, he looked for someone to blame. To an uneducated, illiterate peasantry, blaming the Jews has always been a convenient, albeit false, scapegoat. The Roman Catholic Church would often have stories where they would make up lies about the Jewish people. The lies about the Jewish people, or what the Talmud contains, are legion, and sadly today are being repeated on the internet. And so, for instance, they would say, well, the Jewish people need the blood of a Christian child in order to bake their matzahs for Passover. If you knew what matzah is, you would know how irrational, how impossible that is. But telling lies when you're a racial bigot, when you're a racial person who is racially prejudiced, telling lies against the people for whom you're against is nothing new. That's part of human nature. The Jewish people were then subject to all of these very cruel lies, subject to years of violent persecution, namely the Inquisition of the Roman Catholic Church. The Inquisition was one of those things that swept across Europe. Starting around the year 1600, there were various pogroms. My ancestors were victims of the pogroms. And then eventually, of course, the greatest pogrom of all, the most horrendous, the most horrific, was the Shoah, was the Holocaust. between the years 1938 and 1945. All of these events made the Jewish people of Europe understand that their residence in Europe was very shaky, that they were oftentimes not welcomed. So during the years 1903 to 1906, the pogroms in Ukraine were very severe. Many people were pulled out of their homes, hacked to death with axes in front of their family, sometimes by people who had been in church on Sunday and would murder Jews on Monday. I'm not saying that for dramatic effect. That simply was the fact. These people were members of a false sort of system. They were members of institutional churches that were very big on building buildings and having gold vestments and incense and all sorts of crowns and fancy regalia for their priests. But as far as a loyalty to the Holy Scriptures of God, no, that was not their priority. So they made Jewish people the scapegoat, and Jewish people were very violently persecuted. My great-grandparents, whom I have never met, recognized that there was no future for their children in Europe. And so various ones of my family, my grandparents' older siblings, went to America first, particularly my father's father. His older brothers came to America and eventually sent for him. My father's mother, Sarah Siegel, came across the Atlantic at the age of 16 alone to join her brothers who were already in New York. Her parents knew it was dangerous for her as a teenage girl to remain much longer in the Ukraine. And so the family went to America. They were Orthodox Jewish when they got here, very strict in their religious observance and keeping all of the biblical laws of kashrut. But as was typical, they slowly walked away from many of those traditions. They became much more lenient. And so long story short, my grandparents met and married my father's parents. My mother's family had a very similar story, although they were much even stronger connected to their Yiddish roots. My mother continued speaking Yiddish all of her life, was completely fluent in English, but just as fluent in Yiddish as well. And so my parents met in Brooklyn, New York, in New York City, and they were both involved in professions. My mother was a registered nurse. She was a graduate of the Brooklyn Jewish Hospital. She was a registered nurse. My father also was the first in his family to earn a college degree, and he was a chemist. They established a home in Brooklyn and in a brand new city housing project that had 1,600 families on a quarter-acre ground of land. The buildings, the apartment buildings were 8 stories high. There were 9 families to a building. There were 23 buildings on a quarter-acre square. I'm sorry, not a quarter, on a quarter-mile square plot of land. So once again, on a plot of land that was a quarter-mile square, quarter mile on each side, there were 23 buildings. That's 1,600 families there in the late 1950s, and 90% of them were Jewish families. That's the atmosphere in which I grew up. There were many shopkeepers there who were Orthodox Jewish, many Holocaust survivors. It was common to see people with numbers from the concentration camps. They had the numbers from the death camps, from Auschwitz-Birkenau, and from the others. They had gone there as children, and they were young, they were strong, they survived. So that was the atmosphere. In that atmosphere, I was always told that the cause for our suffering in Europe were people who were Christians. Now, they didn't distinguish what type of Christians they were. My grandparents had no chance to give a theology exam to anyone who was chasing them and trying to kill them. As far as they knew, they were just simply Christians who went to church on Sunday. And so my grandfather's words to me, I can still remember. He would say simply, Mottel, you simply stay away from church buildings. Why? Because his experience in Europe was that if he ever walked by a church building, there would be ruffians hanging out on the steps of the building who would throw stones at him. They would call him, you dirty Jew. They would persecute, they'd run after him. I remember once I might have been 7, 8 years old, holding my grandfather's hand, walking down the street in Brooklyn, and just ahead of us there was a church building. Now these are crowded streets in Brooklyn. What my grandfather did is he purposely crossed over to the other side of the street in order not to walk in front of the church building. Again, it's not because he hated church buildings, it's because he had suffered violent experiences by people who were associated with those buildings. That's why he came to America. So in that atmosphere, I was told, don't go near Jesus, don't go near Christianity. Of course, as soon as you're told not to do something, you want to know why, what is so forbidden about this thing? So in my late teens, 19, 20 years of age, I resolved that I was going to find out about this forbidden Jesus. You have to understand, in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, there was a heavily Jewish section and a heavily Roman Catholic section. All of the Roman Catholics, for at least the vast majority of them in our neighborhood, were second generation from Italy. They were mostly Italian immigrants. Most of my friends in public school were the children of Italian immigrants. They were the only people I knew who believed in Jesus. Certainly my Jewish friends and I did not. The only people I knew who believed in Jesus were all Roman Catholic Italians. So at age 10, I finally figured out the world, and it finally dawned on me that Jesus was Italian. Now, that seems funny to think about that now, but for many Jewish people, that's not an odd thought, because it's hard for them to imagine that he was a Jew. They don't see Jewish people believing in him until now. And so, growing up in that atmosphere, I was always curious about Jesus. Well, along comes the 70s and the whole Jesus freak movement, and many of us, while obviously we're on the periphery of that, we're trying to be good Jewish boys, we're doing the right thing, we're having our bar mitzvah, we're going to Hebrew school, we're honoring our grandparents. At the same time, we see what's going on in the world, and we see this whole Jesus movement. And we're starting to hear that there are lots of Jewish people involved in this Jesus movement. And there were. More and more I wanted to find out about this. So what I did is, I don't think I'd be welcome in the church. I thought to myself, well, if I walk into a church, they're going to probably see that I don't have a ticket and they're going to kick me out. That's how I thought. So I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to go to the public library and I'm going to see if I can find a Christian Bible. Because in our house, it was just Jewish Bibles. So I'm going to see if I can find a Christian Bible. And of course, the Bible is divided up into this thicker, older section here, the Old Testament, and this smaller section, the New Testament. And the New Testament was the book that we did not read. It was the forbidden book. I had been told, I believe it was by my grandfather. I'm not sure if it was my grandfather or rabbi, because we went to Jewish school 2 days a week in the weekdays to prepare for bar mitzvah. And it might have been a rabbi who had said this, but he said, the New Testament is a handbook on how to persecute the Jewish people. That's what I was told growing up. So here I am at age 20 in the public library, and I open up to the first page of this forbidden book, this handbook on how to persecute the Jews. What should I find? I open up to the very first page of the New Testament, and this is the first sentence in the forbidden pages of this Christian Bible. This is the book of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So, 3 people are mentioned, and they are all Jewish. As I continue to read through the book of Matthew, I'm reading the story of a Jewish baby who's born to a Jewish mother in the Jewish town of Bethlehem, in the Jewish province of Judea, occupied by the Romans at that point. And one day, he walks into the synagogue, his hometown synagogue in Nazareth. And in Luke chapter 4, he opens up the scroll of the book of Isaiah, and he reads the portion where it says about the Messiah coming to bring justice and to release those who are oppressed. And he closes the scroll and he says, "Today, this verse has been fulfilled in your hearing." The synagogue erupts in argument. People are yelling, they're shouting, "Who gives you the right to say that you're the Messiah? You're nothing, you're a Nebush, you grew up here, we know your father, he's not wealthy, he's not educated, you didn't go to yeshiva. You think you're the Messiah?" Yet other people were saying, no, Yeshua is very different. He was always very godly, he was always in the Torah. And listen to him. And so a very typical thing happens, a very typical Jewish thing happens. They have a debate. Some think he is the Messiah, some think he is not the Messiah. For the next 3 years of his public ministry, wherever Messiah would go, he'd present himself to the Jewish community. Some would believe he was the Mashiach, others would deny. Ultimately, he was born in the place that the Messiah was to be born, which is Bethlehem. He was born in the miraculous way that Isaiah chapter 7 speaks of, born of a virgin. In one of the previous episodes, we spoke of that. He was born to be the God-man, the king, as Isaiah chapter 9 talks about. And ultimately, he would die as a sacrifice, as Isaiah 53 speaks of. So in all of these ways, Jesus is showing himself to be the Messiah. I came face to face with that evidence. I knew the history of Christendom violently persecuting my Jewish people. But I was not considering joining Christendom. I was considering the person and claims of Jesus to be the Messiah. Finally, I sought out someone who could explain this to me in its original Jewish context. And the Lord led a man by the name of Vincent Morgan to me. Vincent is not Jewish, but Vincent lived for a year in Israel. He spoke Hebrew, could read and write it far better than I could, had lived in Israel, had been on the original Masada excavations, loved the Jewish people, loved our culture. And he sat down with me and for 5 or 6 hours shared all of the messianic prophecies with me. At the end of that session, he said, "Would you like to pray to receive Jesus as your Messiah?" And I said, "No," because I needed to see more. And so I came back 2 weeks later, and for another 5 hours, he showed me more of these messianic prophecies. For another 5 hours, we looked at the Hebrew scriptures, and we saw amazing things. Then he said finally, "I have to show you something startling." And without going into any detail, he opened up his Bible to Daniel chapter 9. And in Daniel chapter 9, we're not going to go there, it's not complex. There's a very simple chronology. In Daniel chapter 9, starting in verses 24 and following, it talks and uses the word Messiah. It talks about the Mashiach, the anointed one. It says the Messiah will appear, then the Messiah will be killed, not simply that he will die, but the Messiah will be killed, and then the temple in Jerusalem will be destroyed. Well, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in the year 70 AD. That meant that the Messiah had to have been born, made his appearance and had been killed before 70 AD. What Jewish man was there that was born in Bethlehem, born of a virgin, was killed all before the year 70 AD? All of it points to just one man, and that is Yeshua, Jesus of Nazareth. I came face to face with it on that night. I was 21 years old. I had looked up all the other passages. It was clear to me that if Jesus was not my Jewish Messiah, there could never be a Messiah because the temple doesn't exist any longer. No one can show they're of the tribe of Judah. That night, I prayed with Vincent to receive Jesus as my Messiah and as my Savior. By faith, I was born again into the family of God. I didn't convert from being Jewish to being anything else. Today, I am a converted sinner. My conversion was from being a habitual sinner to being a child of God. I'm still Jewish. I have no other choice. I like being Jewish. It's God's choice. I trust in his wisdom in this. I can't be Irish. I can't be Italian. If you are, mazel tov. It's great to be Irish or Italian. I can't be any of those things. I can only be Jewish. I am a Jewish believer in Messiah Jesus. I can only imagine that some of you know Jewish people who need to hear this message. You can show them this recording, this videotape. You can search my name on the internet. You can find my testimony in various forms. Feel free to contact me here through GLC. I'm happy to respond to questions. I will get back to you. Happy to talk with people who do not yet know the Messiah. Our Messiah is Jewish, but he's the Messiah for everyone, for Jew and Gentile equally. It's been a pleasure being with you this season here through the ministry of GLC. We appreciate their work and collaborate with them. My name is Mottel Baleston, and if you're a believer in Jesus, I am your brother. Shalom, shalom.